Hey everyone, let's get started with the glaze painting and get an idea of what we're going to do on that. So we started off with a monochromatic painting. Right here is my example that I painted for this project. We call it monochromatic, but in this case, the painting has mine is predominantly raw umber and ivory black and white. So I've got a little bit of a cooler areas that I can do with cooler, or I can do it a little bit warmer. Um, and then the important thing with this is not to go overly dark on the painting, to make sure that even your darks are fairly like lighter value, and that you don't go much darker than like a 6 or a 7. So that because when you start laying in the glazes on top, it can get dark really fast. And it's really easy to darken it with the glaze, but if you want to lighten it, it's kind of a couple steps to lighten it. So it's better if you start out with the underpainting just slightly lighter, I feel. Um, it's really important as we get into glazing that we pay particular attention to our color theory. And I'll explain that with the palette here. Let's get rid of this and pull up the palette. Basically, this is the palette that you guys are using, or something kind of close to this. And we don't have a lot of like neutrals on here. So what we end up doing is we end up moving across our color wheel when we need to neutralize something. Um, so in other words, if we need to make something green and and the green ends up being like a stronger, brighter green, which is very typical with some of these glaze colors, that they're really rich in pigments, especially because now we have so many like really rich chemically based pigments like the phthalos available to us. If we want to tone down that, like that phthalo green or phthalo blue a little bit, moving across our color wheel can really help us do that. So if we're toning down like a phthalo blue, we might want to take something that's kind of in the orange red family. And it might not necessarily be a bright red orange, but it might be that if I start out with my phthalo blue, this is the phthalo blue right here. You can see over here, and you can see that it's been kind of like worked into slightly, that it doesn't feel quite as bright as it might be. That's because I picked up a little bit of these orangey tones. This earth red, this is a transparent earth red right here, and I picked this up and moved it into it. So this is really important to pay attention to our color theory as we're working on the glaze painting. It allows us to move into our shadows and get them to not feel like candy colored, overly saturated, to have things feel a little bit more realistic and all that. So, and hopefully these are lessons that you learned in beginning painting, working with color and temperature and so on. As we stated before in the first glaze lecture, glazing is a term that we use, and sometimes it can sound like something really uh, kind of crazy and complicated, and it can be very complicated, but really ultimately all glazing is it's kind of like staining something. It's using transparent color, and all these pigments have inherent properties, whether they're going to be opaque, like whites or cadmiums tend to be opaque, or whether they're going to have transparency to them, like the pigments that we've chosen to use on this painting. The pigments that I gave you guys in the plastic wrap, those are your glaze pigments. You don't use a lot of them. They're used fairly thinly for the most part. You can see I've put just really tiny little piles here. These are my big piles up here, so you get an idea. These are actually pretty small. They're about the same size you guys have. And you can see that even after the whole first pass, this is taken at the end of painting yesterday, that I still have lots and lots of color left. So luckily, some of these are pretty expensive, so luckily you don't use a ton of it. So keep in mind that color theory becomes really essential when you're working on this. If you want to desaturate colors or get them to look a little more realistic and not too like bright and spectrumy, then you need to work across your color wheel on this. We'll bring up this picture again, the palette, in a little bit. This is the photo that I was working from. Basically, I had taken down the still life once we went to online, so I'm using these photos, and I use this to build my monochromatic painting that I showed you. This is a little bit at an angle, as you can see, but I painted it monochromatically. I knew I had some corrections to make to the vase and stuff like that, but I chose to leave this out just because it's kind of like poking in there at the back, and I can't get, not like a good element to have in there as far as like composition. Otherwise, everything that's kind of within my little realm here is all in place. I'm going to leave this image up so that you guys can kind of see like what I'm trying to work towards as I work on this painting, and I'm going to move through it a little bit. So you guys have a little container that I gave you that has kind of golden liquid in it. And that golden liquid that's in that container is Galkyd medium. It's Galkyd light medium. And that's basically an alkyd resin that is made by Gamblin Paints. I don't like to use that by itself because it tacks up on the surface too quickly for my taste. And I don't like when things get overly tacky and I can't move them around still. So what I do is I put in some linseed oil in that. I usually about half and half, about half linseed oil, half of the Galkyd light. The Galkyd will still cause it to dry more quickly, but the linseed oil will give you a little bit more working time with it, which I really like. And so the first thing that I do is kind of prep my surface with some of that. You saw me just doing that with the brush. And then as I go through, after I've done that, then I start putting in color. And so in this case, I picked up some of the olive green. I started off with olive green, and then I moved into adding in the sap green and some yellows as I wanted to keep building it. And so I just go through, and I'm not like overly working it at this point. I'm just trying to get a layer of paint in there that I can basically work back into and smooth out. And the brushes I like to use are these Da Vinci Black Sables. I recommend you can lay it in with a bristle brush, but you're going to find the bristle brush leaves a lot of these brush marks in the glaze, and that can be really distracting. So this is kind of the time that you want to bring out some of those soft hair brushes that I had mentioned that would be good for the intermediate class to use. So let's kind of move through some of this because it took me a little bit to get the paint down on there. And you can see there's a little shift in color, so I added a little bit of the indigo blue, which is what I had here. My colors might be slightly different from yours because I didn't make that little plastic thing for me. I used my own paints once I got home. So you guys, I think, have Payne's Gray, which is actually pretty close to indigo blue. It's just slightly less blue than it. And I use that for the shadow. This is more of the olive green and then some sap green. And then what I'm doing is as I work back into this wet glaze, I'm bringing in just a little bit of white on my brush, and I had a little bit of cadmium yellow out so that I could warm it up and not have it get too chalky too quick. Normally, if I were working in this, I would use something like flake white, but you guys don't have flake white, and so I stuck with the titanium white that is the same as what you guys would be using. But the nice thing with using a flake white or a Kremnitz white is that it really moves into this, and it's somewhat transparent still. It's not quite so heavy as titanium white. Let's move through that a little bit. So you can see that what I'm doing is I'm working that white back into the glaze tone, and that white picks up a lot of the glaze tone. It allows me to lighten it back up in that area a little bit and keep some of the color and build kind of a sense of kind of like almost a glowing light that happens inside there, which is really nice. And this is kind of how I use the glaze. Like we covered in the first lecture, there are a lot of different ways of using glaze, just what I like to do. I do like to work back in a little bit with some opaque whites and cadmium colors, sometimes depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. And then what I will do is I'll come back and I'll even glaze back on top of this. So this essentially what I'm covering today is my first pass on the glazing painting, getting everything kind of blocked in with some color and getting the beginning of my lights and shadows kind of established as far as color. Move this bar out of the way up here a little bit more. So you can see that I'm kind of just coming in with more of that medium. I'm using the color fairly thinly. I haven't started smoothing it out really yet. I'm just kind of blocking in and trying to get some color into all of this area and establishing this is all my green drapery. And I have a lot that I have to do with it. In fact, you can kind of see if we look at these later versions here, the later movies, that it kind of smooths out as I keep going. But this is a process. Like I keep smoothing it out as I go up in layers as well. So I'm gonna move this here so we can focus on this. Okay, so I'm just still like brushing in all of that color. And then I come back in with some whites, and this thing was moving around on me a lot because it's a loose sheet of canvas paper, and I finally got fed up with it and taped it down in a minute. But it just kept moving and tossing around with my paintbrush. Hopefully you guys don't have that issue because you're on more of a board or a canvas. So I just kept moving in more color in there, trying to kind of soften what I was doing, build some lights back into it. Worked back in. You can see on my brush down here at the bottom that I've got a little bit of like a yellow white. So I picked up a little bit of that cadmium yellow and then a little bit of the titanium white, and I mixed kind of a tint of the yellow, and I'm mixing that back in and just getting some of this light of this fold right here established back into this. You can wipe it out as well. I'll show you on some later areas in the painting. That's what I do, is I kind of wipe it out more with a towel. There's different ways of kind of treating the glazing. But like I said, I do like coming back through and kind of reestablishing my lights with some cadmiums. Here I'm working on the bottom part. So you can see kind of here where it was rough, and then I start blocking back in some of the lights and shadows, softening it down, refining some of like what I think the various values are going to be, and I continually refine that as I keep going. I try not to like finish an area completely. I try to kind of move it up to some place that feels pretty comfortable and then work on something else, and then come back and move it up a little bit more and then work on something else. So you'll see a lot of that. I decided that these tones here needed to be a little bit softer and not quite so heavy and dark. I might darken them more later, but for now I kind of lightened them up a little bit because they were getting a little heavy for me. And so I came into that interior fold and did the same thing, and used a little bit of kind of a darker value that I had some white in also, so it had more opacity. Here I'm just trying to kind of reestablish and refine some of these folds a little bit, get the light the way that I want it to be in there. I came back in later and kind of lightened this up because that's a little bit dark there. Trying to get more of the feeling of this like tucking and rolling under. And then I moved to working on the box for a little bit. I needed a break from green. So as I came in on the box, I predominantly used the transparent earth brown that I had, some transparent earth red as well, and then a little bit of indigo to darken it. You'll see that in a minute. That's this bottom corner is where I'd added in a little bit of indigo initially, and I hit a little bit up here. I came back and trying to mimic some of this like dark versus more medium brown. I did hit more indigo into this. So you can see that I kind of hit like along this crease here in the wood, as well as brushing back into some of these areas. The nice thing with the glazing is you can let it almost pick up and feel a little bit like some of that wood texture. So I didn't overly work this top part. I did a little bit on there and I just kind of got distracted with other things. And there I'm using a little bit of that indigo blue. For you guys, you'd use that Payne's gray. It's very similar. It's kind of a smoky blue gray. And it's very transparent. And then as I came in down here into the box, I used predominantly the indigo again and a little bit of brown with it so it didn't get overly blue toned. And you can see I kind of darkened it up even more and a little bit stronger, trying to get the shadows back into that because it was kind of mid-toned, if you remember. Then I hit some more indigo blue into some of these areas. I'm hitting it into some of this back shadowing that goes behind the branch. And then I softened that just a little bit back into the green, hitting these places like where the branch hits the wood and is resting on the wood. And I took a break from the branch for a little bit. And I predominantly used the phthalo blue for this vase. It's kind of a warm green blue, and I knew that when I lightened it, I could get something that was fairly close to that color. And there's where I'm taking a little bit of towel, I'm kind of wiping out some of my lights. And I'm going to work back into that with some whites as well. But that makes it so I'm not fighting so much some of the pigment in that area, and it allows some of my underpainting to come through a little bit better. You can see how nice this blue like kind of creates the shadowing and stuff within there. I came back through and worked some more, wiped it out, and then when I started building up the light in that, I came in with a little bit more green into it, because as it comes into that light area, I wanted more of that warmth. Lightened it back out again with the towel, and then came in and hit just a little bit of white in there, trying to pick up some of these colors, get some of the warmth that I see kind of in here, where it's almost like you can get these casts of yellows. And just kept trying to refine some of the painting in there. I like to hit a little bit of highlights, even if I'm going to lose them again, it's okay. Just because it keeps me thinking about the textures. It's something that might come through my painting. One of the things I really love about glazing is the way how you can build up these layers. You can really build up the sense of kind of a luster to the paint, and a real richness to the pigment, and that some of these layers might get lost as you glaze over it, and on the other hand, you'll kind of catch them as the light refracts just here and there on them. So that's the end of that video. And then I believe this was the next one. Let me double check. Yes. So this one was the next one. And so you can see that this vase is, I've tried to, I need to correct it. Like if you really look at this, the drawing is a little bit off, but I kind of like the shape, so I'm not overly worrying about that. It's close enough. And I'm more worried about getting the color and so on correct in this. So I'm building a little bit of light back into that front rim, and I added a bit of yellow into that because as I look at this, I see a lot of like yellows and greens. I don't overdevelop the shadows. A lot of times I let them remain somewhat undeveloped, and it's more important to me that the lights really stand out and have some resonance to them. So here I'm just kind of coming in again with that little bit of whites, trying to hit some of that texture back in. I hit just a little bit of white in here to get a feeling of some of reflected light down there, and then I worked back in with a clean brush and tried to soften, hit the glaze, and I'll probably glaze that back just a little bit, but I wanted it to pick up a little bit of the shape of the vase down there. Then I decided I was going to start blocking in. So my blue background, you can tell, if you look at this compared to this feels like it has lavender in it. So I came in predominantly with some of the, I think it was the indigo, and then some cobalt mixed in it, because I had some cobalt blue on there. And I think I used a touch of the dioxazine violet and mixed that in as well, which is a very cool blue violet. And you can see here, this is where you can really tell that I added in some of the purple. And I have a really obnoxious dog. So here I'm blocking in some of the lights, trying to pick back up some of this, and I definitely, when I come back and I glaze this a second time, I want to push it even more to some of the pinks and purples, and that's probably what I'll do on the second pass, is add a little bit of pink and purple into it, and then glaze the blues back on top of it again, so that that becomes like a layer that you kind of, that the light refracts through and you see. Just trying to clean up some of this. Mix in some lights. I didn't want to get overly busy on that background drapery, so I don't have like references to all the little wrinkles and folds. To me, the part of the painting I really wanted to focus on was this vase and this pear. Kind of like this area right here was what was really important to me. I knocked down some of that shadowing because it just felt a little too strong back there. See, I got rid of that. Lightened, and then I tried to create just enough reference to the light and so on in the background that it feels like it's paid attention to, but not so much that it'll take away from the painting that's in front of it. Brought in and tried to clean up some of that edge of that vase a little bit. And my hand shakes a lot, so that top part I had to come back and fix. So there's basically that part of the painting. And then this right here is the last few minutes before I switch the video over to Zoom. So unfortunately, the last part of the painting with the pear and so on was actually done on Zoom and isn't videotaped. But I'm going to pull up a photo of it once I finished with it for now and kind of talk. So you can see I put a little bit of blues into this underlying shadow. I like to continue all of my drapery at once so that I keep the color constant. I don't like forget something and shift my color more than I mean to. Put a little bit of blue into that bottle even though I knew I was going to lose it with the top browns. Just helps me to kind of pay attention to it, and I don't mind if it mixes a little bit into that brown in those places. And then hit a little bit of the light. Tried to refine some of that. And some of the light in those back areas. And this was the point that I actually moved over to Zoom. So let me pull up an image and kind of talk a little bit about where I left it when I took off yesterday. So after I switched over to Zoom, I worked on this pear for a little bit. I worked on the branch. I blocked in the bottle, an initial block in on the bottle, and then I blocked in some color within the skull. So the pear, I predominantly used a lot of like sap green. I touched a little bit of orange into it here, so the red, orange, and a little bit of the quinacridone gold. And I believe you guys have quinacridone gold as well, because I liked this bit of warmth right here, and I didn't want to lose that in my final painting. I used just a little bit of indigo mixed in down here. The difference between the shadow and the light part is just that the light part has yellows and whites mixed into it, and the shadow I didn't do that. So this is that same sap green. It's got the shadow of my underpainting also, helping make it darker. A little bit of indigo in these areas to give them just a little bit more oomph, and a little bit of indigo back here. This is predominantly a little bit of the quinacridone, and then I mixed in some of the cadmium yellow, which has more opacity, and the titanium white into my sap green to really give this a lot of warmth and more yellow. As I look at this compared to this has a lot more yellow in it. This is a more washed out green. And so that's what I was trying to get at. On the branch, I used some indigos and some purples in my shadows. I predominantly hit it though with a glaze of the transparent earth brown that I had. And then I just came back in with my whites and tried to establish and hit some of my texture back in here. And then use the indigo and purples to kind of pull in some of my shadowing. I feel like what will happen is I need to hit like some yellows and wipe them out once it dries. And then wipe them out quite a lot, but I want to warm this up. It's a very cold white right now, and I'd like to get it more to a warmer, more welcoming white. I'll probably do the same thing with the skull, is hit some warmth back on top of that as well. But one thing that I really focused on with the skull is I hit a little bit more cobalt blues into the shadows. I really love cobalt blue, even though it's not technically a glaze color. It's more of a semi-transparent color. It just does this smoky mid-tone blue that's really beautiful for hitting these very soft, delicate shadows and so on. So that's what I used a lot of in these areas. And then a little bit of browns or indigos when I wanted to darken it a little bit more fully. I used a lot of like my quinacridones throughout this. What I did is I warmed the whole thing up and I hit it with like some of my transparent earth reds and the quinacridone gold. And then I came back through and hit lots of whites into it and knocked it back and cooled it all off again. So what I will do next time, and I'm trying to build up some of this bone texture and so on in there. So what I will do next time is basically warm this back up again and reestablish some of this and let some of this underpainting still come through so it builds more and more texture. I love this coolness here, so I'm a little torn. I hate to just warm the whole thing up because I kind of like the way this coolness relates to some of these other areas. And that's one of the decisions you make when you're doing this is maybe you don't, we're not after photo representation, okay? So we want it to read like it's a skull, but I don't want to necessarily feel like, well, I just like photo represented exactly what was here because otherwise, what's the point? I want to look for things that I want to accentuate and I want to make more beautiful. The bottle down here, I just hit a little bit of the transparent earth brown. I came back in and re-hit some highlights in here. Definitely needs like some warmth to it, so I'll probably hit a little bit of quinacridone gold and then that transparent earth brown again next time. And I didn't really do too much more to the box other than what you guys saw. So that's basically it. Let's look at this palette really quick and I'll talk to you about what colors I have here. So this is my transparent earth brown. I believe I gave you guys some of this. This is a rose. It's very similar to alizarin crimson, not quite so maroon feeling. It's a little bit more of a pink feel to it. This is transparent earth red. This is a quinacridone, or no, this was a quinacridone burnt scarlet. This is my transparent earth red, which is this is basically the color here. It's very similar to burnt sienna, but it's transparent as far as like coloration. This is the quinacridone gold. I don't have Indian yellow. I gave you guys Indian yellow, which is a slightly more orange tone than this. I looked through my boxes though and I didn't have it, but I did have a Hansa yellow, which is a transparent yellow. It's just not quite so orange yellow as what you guys have. This is the sap green. This is olive green, which you can see the difference, hopefully even just from this photo. This has just a little bit more brown to it. You can actually kind of see it up here as well. This is more of the bright green of the sap green, and then this over here has a little bit more of the olive green in it. This is my phthalo blue. This is the cobalt blue. I don't believe I gave you guys this, but I did give you guys blues, okay? This is the indigo. What you guys have, I believe, is the Payne's gray instead. I did not have a manganese violet. I gave you guys manganese violet, which is more of a red violet. I did have this dioxazine violet, which is obviously a lot cooler in tone. So you guys just want to play around with this. You're not going to necessarily have the exact same colors. Some of them you do. Some of them are a little bit different. You just want to kind of play around. And then up here I've got a cadmium yellow light and then titanium white. And that's basically what I used on this. You can kind of see how I would thin them down, how I had areas that I added in like some white. I made some pink tones. This is what I used on the skull. When I was starting to block in the lights again. I've got different, like this is basically brown, this transparent earth brown, a little bit of the transparent earth red, and then indigo over here. This shows the purple mixed with a little bit of browns.